The twin suns of the Los Prime were setting when the wind carried the scent of exile across the wastelands, dry and metallic, mingled with the whispers of sand devils that spun along the barren horizon. In the distance, under the crumbled archways of what had once been a transit tower, a figure stumbled through the dust like a shadow come to life, her form cloaked in shredded thermal garb that barely clung to her frame. Her arms clutched a small bundle against her chest, swaddled in thin silken wrappings that shimmered faintly like the dying light above. She walked as if each step was chosen with pain, her knees giving out more often than her pride allowed. But the sound she feared most wasn't the crack of her own bones, nor the gurgling rumble of her empty stomach. It was the silence from the bundle she cradled so fiercely. For if her child stopped breathing, if that tiny chest stopped rising and falling, she would no longer have the strength to keep going, and the desert would take them both without memory or mark, like it had done to so many before. Her name had once been revered Velshera, matron of the Azure Veil, speaker of the crystalline lineage, but none of that mattered anymore. Not after the Council of Sires deemed her child a genetic aberration, a misalignment in their pure lineage. She had pleaded, offered to resign her post, even to vanish quietly, but they had spat judgment in the old tongue, accusing her of diluting the bloodlines with unspoken impurities, of birthing what they called a flesh-born error. When she tried to resist, they bound her in irons etched with ancestral sigils and paraded her through the glass-tiled streets of Zalvarin before casting her and the child beyond the outer barrier into the exile zone. That was 17 days ago, or maybe 19. The desert no longer counted time in a way that meant anything to her. Each hour was simply marked by the struggle to breathe, to find shade, to keep the child fed with the meager nutrients from her own body until it began to take more than she had left to give. She collapsed near dusk, her vision swimming with heat, ghosts, and pain. Her knees struck cracked clay, and she barely shielded the child before tumbling sideways onto the dirt. The taste of blood filled her mouth. She whispered something in her native tongue, a lullaby to a god she no longer believed in, hoping it would quiet the whimpers rising from the bundle in her arms. She hadn't noticed the approaching sound until it was too close to run, though she couldn't have run anyway, not anymore. It was the clanking tread of something massive, a machine with intent. Her heart thundered against her ribs. Raiders? Slavers? Wild scavengers? Then the silhouette emerged against the lavender dusk, a vehicle of crude but efficient make, its frame cobbled from off-worlder tech and local materials, its exhaust trailing a long black ribbon into the air. And atop it, a man not her kind, not any kind she recognized, though his form bore the weary strength of one who had long since made peace with suffering. He was human. He said nothing when he stopped the vehicle a few meters away, stepping off with a grunt, boots crunching on loose rocks and bones bleached by wind. His coat was worn, patched with materials she couldn't name, and a dust mask hung around his neck like a forgotten talisman. He approached her slowly, as though nearing a wild animal. But when he knelt beside her and saw the child, something ancient flickered behind his eyes, not pity, but memory. He didn't ask what she was or how she came to be here. He just took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders and gently checked the pulse of the child. Then, without a word, he lifted them both into the seat of his vehicle, turned the wheel, and drove them into the night. She blacked out before they even reached the cliffs. The farm was not what she expected, not that she had expected anything at all, but it wasn't a ruin, wasn't an outpost of desperation. It was alive, fenced by low walls made of reclaimed or slabs and dense wood. The land inside held a few rows of strange blue-leaf crops that fed from artificial root misting systems, and a trio of large, lumbering cattle beasts with translucent hides grazed under the moon lamps. A battered homestead stood in the center, partially buried into the hillside for insulation, and when the man carried her and her child inside, the air was warm, smelling of spice and old wood. The lighting was soft and yellow, nothing like the sterile beams of her old life in the crystalline domes. She awoke briefly when he laid her on the cot, tried to speak, but he simply held up a finger, as if to say, "Rest now." He placed the child beside her and left the room. For days she drifted in and out of a half-conscious haze, only aware of the world when it fed her broth or when the child whimpered in hunger and was brought strange but nourishing liquids that the infant drank eagerly. He didn't speak until the third day. She was sitting upright then, cradling the now stabilized child, wrapped in linen unfamiliar to her but soft. The human sat across from her at a table, sipping a steaming drink from a dented metal cup. His voice was gravel, worn down from solitude or loss or both. "Name?" he asked. She blinked slowly. "Velshera," she rasped. He nodded. "I'm Jonah." She didn't expect more. But he added, after a moment, "Jonah Myers. Used to be engineer class, back on Europa Station. Retired to here when it went bad." He gestured vaguely at the stars. She nodded slowly, unsure what else to say. "This place. Yours. Yeah, ain't much. But it's mine." He sipped. "I saw your kind once. During the Delcorna push. You folks were taller back then. I was taller once too," she whispered, more to herself than to him. He looked at the child. "Yours?" "Yes." He stared into the mug. "Does it have a name?" She hesitated, then said, "Allery." There was silence for a while. Then he said softly, "She's lucky. You kept her alive." Velshera turned her gaze downward. "Barely." Jonah shrugged. "Barely's better than not." That was how it began, with silence and broken words shared across a table that had seen better days. Velshera stayed inside the homestead for another cycle, recovering, helping Jonah with minor tasks where her strength allowed, tending the crops, preparing food, maintaining the filtration systems that kept the farm alive. The child grew stronger as well, now cooing and gurgling in a language not yet formed, eyes watching Jonah whenever he entered the room as if trying to understand what kind of creature he was. Jonah rarely asked about her past. He never demanded explanations, never pressed her to confess the crimes that led her to be exiled. In turn, she respected his silences, his wounds that spoke through the occasional limp in his left leg or the distant look in his eyes whenever he fixed a broken valve with fingers that trembled faintly. They were two broken beings in a world that no longer cared for either of them, and somehow, that became a bond stronger than shared blood. One night, during a storm that lashed against the outer walls with winds that screamed like banshees from the mines, Velshera stood by the window, holding Allery close, and asked quietly, "Why did you help me?" Jonah didn't look up from his seat near the hearth. "Because once, someone helped me. Back when I didn't deserve it." She turned toward him, her violet eyes shimmering in the firelight. "And did it matter?" He met her gaze and said without flinching, "Everything does. When there's a child involved." She watched him a long time, then whispered, "Your world is cruel." He took a breath. "So is every world. But we get to choose what part we play in it." Velshera looked down at her daughter, who was now asleep against her chest. She pressed a gentle kiss to the infant's brow. Then, without fully understanding why, she crossed the room and sat beside him by the fire. Jonah didn't speak. He didn't need to. In that silence, something passed between them, something ancient and unspoken. Not quite love, not yet, but not just survival either. The wind outside howled on, but inside, for the first time in weeks, Velshera felt warmth that wasn't borrowed from the sun or stolen from a machine. It came from the crackling fire, from the human beside her, from the life they might yet build, if fate allowed it. And so, a mother once shamed, a child once doomed, and a man once broken sat together in the quiet dark, breathing life back into hope. The following days unfolded like petals of a cautious bloom, slow, hesitant, touched by frost, but warmed by light that neither of them had expected to find in one another. Velshera adjusted quickly to the rhythms of Jonah's world, for survival was no longer her only concern. She found that the routine, however humble, brought a strange solace to the noise that had once filled her head. No orders barked from shimmering hollow panels, no sterile silence of her former cast's crystal towers, just the gentle groan of the water recyclers kicking on at dawn, the soft bleating of livestock as they shuffled toward the feed lines, and Jonah's voice as he muttered to himself while tightening bolts, tending his broken old loader droid, or adjusting crop arrays. Though her body still bore the wounds of exile, bruises like ink stains across her back, ribs that flared with pain in the cold, she insisted on helping him. At first, he tried to keep her inside. "You're healing," he said. "No need to wear yourself out." But she had only looked at him, her gaze steady but not unkind, and said, "If I do not help, I will feel useless. And that will kill me faster than the wounds." After that, he stopped protesting. He simply handed her tools, taught her how to operate the irrigation nozzles, and occasionally, when she got something wrong, gently corrected her with a patience she found unsettling in its generosity. Valerie grew stronger too. Her color returned, the ashen tinge that had haunted her cheeks replaced by soft violet and blue hues more fitting for her age. Her eyes, luminous and deep, watched everything, especially Jonah. She would giggle when he made silly noises, or when he stumbled over the alien-sounding lullabies Velshera taught him. Sometimes, when Velshera came back from checking the hydroponics, she would find Allery curled up in Jonah's lap as he read aloud from old paper-bound books, stories of ancient Earth filled with dragons, stars, and trees that sang. One evening, after working through the heat to stabilize a collapsed portion of the western crop wall, Velshera sat on the porch beside Jonah. The sun was dipping low, turning the sky into molten gold behind the ragged mountains. Her arms were sore, and her hands were blistered, but she felt more whole than she had in years. Jonah passed her a flask of cool water, and for a while, they just drank and listened to the wind. Then, without looking at her, he said, "She looks like you." Velshera smiled, her face softening in the fading light. "She has my eyes, but her father's spirit." Jonah nodded slowly. Not with you. He is dead," she said, not as a wound, but as a fact. "He was a warrior of the flame caste. When they learned what we had created together, they erased his name from the halls. Then they erased him." Jonah clenched his jaw, not out of judgment, but quiet rage that any civilization, however advanced, could be so monstrous in the name of purity. "And they call that justice?" "They call it tradition," Velshera said. "But it is the same." He turned toward her, his eyes shadowed. "What about you? Why exile, not death?" She laughed bitterly. "Because death would have made me a martyr. And martyrs are dangerous. But a broken woman crawling through the wastelands with a sickly child? That's not a threat. That's a warning." Jonah shook his head. "Sounds like they're scared of you." "They are," she said quietly. "Or rather, what I represent. Change. A new future that doesn't worship bloodlines, but choices." Jonah glanced at Allery, who was asleep in her sling nearby. "Then you're the bravest damn person I've ever met." They sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that didn't require mending. As the stars came out, Velshera tilted her head and whispered, "There's something you should know." Jonah raised an eyebrow. "She is not only different by blood. She is gifted." He blinked. "How do you mean?" Velshera touched her chest, over the heart. "She feels more than I do. Not just emotions. She senses pain. She sensed your kindness before you ever spoke. That's why she didn't cry when you touched her. It's part of the mutation. Or perhaps evolution." Jonah rubbed his chin. Like empathy turned up to 11. She nodded. "And more. If trained, if allowed to grow, she may become something our people feared because they could not control it." Jonah looked at her, long and hard. "Will they come looking for her?" Velshera looked away. "If the priest sense her life signature still exists, perhaps. But I made sure our trail was buried. There were sacrifices." He didn't ask what kind. He simply nodded and said, "Then if they come, we'll be ready." The word "we" made something stir in Velshera. It had been so long since she had been part of any "we" that wasn't a lie or a duty or a war. Now it felt like a promise. That night, Jonah gave her the small guest room he had once used for storage. Velshera cleaned it with the same reverence her ancestors once gave to temple rituals. She arranged the child's cradle with blankets Jonah had offered, added woven mats to the walls for insulation, and set an old holographic frame in the corner that displayed a gentle aurora cycle. When Jonah passed by, he stopped and stared at what she had done. "You made this a home," he said. Velshera turned, startled by his tone. "Is that not good?" "No," he said softly. "It's perfect. It's just been a long time since these walls had purpose beyond survival." She smiled, and the smile was not sharp, not defensive, but warm and full of light. "Then let us give them purpose again." And from that night on, the farmhouse was no longer a shelter. It became something more. It became a sanctuary. Time moved differently on the edge of forgotten worlds. It wasn't measured in digital calendar bursts or in rhythmic sirens announcing the end of labor shifts. Instead, it passed with the waxing of moons, the slow crack of ice around the water cisterns each dawn, the stretching shadows of the tall wind vanes as dusk crept across the farmland. It was a rhythm ancient and raw, And it was in this rhythm that Velshera and Allery began to truly live. The human Jonah did not ask much of them, not in word. But the land asked, constantly pulling weeds, mending broken feed lines, resetting perimeter sensors when desert storms snapped them like twigs. The land was demanding, but it was fair. It gave back what you gave it, and Velshera, once clad in silks and woven crystalline robes, now wore a coarse tunic as she worked the earth with hands that bled and healed and bled again. Jonah had an old survey drone named Peg, a floating thing with a cracked camera lens and uneven thruster pulses, but it followed her like a loyal dog and beeped in approval whenever she did something right. It also had a personality matrix that Jonah had never gotten around to disabling. It would mutter things like, "You're digging with style today," or "soil acidity at 4.2 like my mood," which made Velshera laugh the first time it happened. Jonah, watching from the other side of the greenhouse, had smiled when he heard it, though he pretended to be busy with crop data logs. Allery was now crawling, her small hybrid body adapting fast to this new life. She didn't cry much, didn't need to. Her empathy bled into everything. When the old solar grid overloaded one afternoon and Jonah dropped his wrench in frustration, Allery had immediately begun to whimper. Velshera rushed in, assuming injury, only to find her daughter staring at Jonah with a tremble in her lip, not because she was scared, but because she felt his anger and confusion. Jonah had knelt and apologized to the child, stunned as she instantly calmed and reached for him. "She's incredible," he whispered afterward. "She will be more than that," Velshera said, "if given the chance." Jonah squinted at the horizon, at the faint outline of dust rising far beyond the distant ridges. "Then we'll make sure she gets it." Jonah began teaching Velshera more about the systems that kept the farm alive. Old Terran tech patched with scavenged alien circuits, solar fields intertwined with geothermal backups, a rain collector that only worked during the season of frozen night, when the clouds wept briefly across the desert. He was meticulous in his instructions, sometimes harsh when he feared mistakes could endanger them, but he was never unkind. Velshera learned fast, her mind sharp from years of political strategy and biological mastery in her former life, now repurposed towards something so much simpler and somehow more meaningful. "You were a noble, weren't you?" Jonah asked one evening while repairing one of the farm's wind turbines. They sat together on the high ledge overlooking the valley, the structure humming softly beneath them as lights flickered across the crop fields below like fireflies. "I was more than that," she said after a pause. "And less. My name once opened doors that have since been sealed. I negotiated with planets, held sway over bloodlines older than your son." Jonah whistled softly. "And now you clean drip filters with me." Velshera smiled. "Yes. And strangely, it feels more honest." He looked at her then, really looked at the faded scars under her cheekbones, the way her lavender skin had tanned under this world's harsh light, at the quiet strength in her jawline. "You know, I used to think this place was just where I came to wait out the end." She turned. "And now?" He didn't answer at first. He watched Allery toddling awkwardly across the inner courtyard, chasing the flickering shadow of Peg. "Now I think maybe it was waiting for you." That night, Velshera stood under the stars with Allery wrapped against her chest. The stars were different here than the ones above Zalvarin. These were wild stars, untamed, unclaimed by any council or caste. She felt small beneath them, but not afraid. It was a humbling kind of smallness, the kind that reminded her there were forces in the universe that did not care for bloodlines or traditions, only for life itself and its refusal to yield. But not all forces were so gentle. It began the next week. A subtle flicker in the perimeter grid, a disruption in the motion sensors that wasn't caused by weather or beasts. Jonah triple-checked the relay, swore it was just interference, but Velshera felt the prickle in her spine, an instinct born not from paranoia, but from survival. She had felt this kind of silence before, the kind that comes just before something terrible arrives. Jonah reinforced the barriers. He retrieved a pulse rifle from a hidden compartment under the floor, old Earth military grade, ionized and scarred from 100 battles. Velshera recognized the weapon's hum, its power signature a relic from the War of the Nine Rims. "You fought?" she asked. He nodded. "Did things I don't talk about. Left the war with more regrets than medals." She studied him. "And yet you saved a stranger with a child." He smiled, but there was no joy in it. Maybe I was trying to earn something back. They spent that night tightening every system, calibrating defense turrets, reinforcing the drones with old shielding coils. Allery slept through it all, but Velshera kept one hand on her cradle, her thoughts spinning through escape routes, and ancient codes burned into her mind. Because on the second night, the storm came. Not a weather front, not a sand squall. A machine. No engines. No noise. Just a ripple in the soil, as if the world itself held its breath. Then shadows tall, elegant, and hateful stepped beyond the hills, their robes flowing like oil, their faces hidden behind masks of ancestral bone. Sires of Zalvarin. Exarchs of the Purity castes. Jonah saw them through the scope. Friends of yours? Velshera didn't blink. No. They come to finish what they began. Jonah chambered the rifle and looked at her. Then they're trespassers. Velshera nodded once, her voice low and fierce. Then let us show them the cost of crossing a mother. Jonah didn't waste words. He moved through the shadows of his own home like a wraith, his rifle slung across his back and a small hollow projector clenched in his left hand, tapping into the old farm's defense relay grid. His eyes flicked between displays, adjusting shielding arcs and bringing the ancient but dependable auto turrets online. Velshera, standing beside him in the low-lit control alcove, barely recognized herself in the glinting screen reflections. Her face was sharper now, her posture coiled with purpose. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a protector again, and this time, it wasn't for a world that betrayed her or a council that cast her out. This time, it was for the child sleeping in the next room, for the man beside her who had offered shelter without demand, for something that mattered. Outside, the desert wind stilled unnaturally, and in that quiet, the first voice came. Velshera of the Azure Veil. You were given exile. You were granted the mercy of anonymity. Yet you defied it. You fed the child. You nurtured the aberration. This world does not belong to you. Surrender the life form, and the pain will end quickly. Jonah grunted. Polite bunch. They speak the old dialect, Velshera murmured, her voice like stone cracking under pressure. And they lie. There is no mercy in their kind. If they take Allery, she will not be destroyed. She will be dissected, studied, turned into a blueprint for genocide. Jonah's knuckles tightened on the projector. Then we hold the line. From the window, the silhouettes had multiplied. 6, no 7 figures in full ceremonial exogarb, cloaked in synth-threaded robes that shimmered between reality and shadow. Their feet never touched the ground. They floated slightly above the earth, as if to show their disdain for all things that crawled. Between them, suspended in a lattice of energy, was a pulsating weapon, a bionullifier tuned for targeted lineage purges. Velshera recognized it instantly. It had been banned by her own ancestors 5 centuries ago. Its use now confirmed everything she feared. The council had sanctioned the purge. Her daughter's death had been declared sacred. But Allery was no longer a political inconvenience. She was her child. She was Jonah's daughter in everything but blood. And she would not die here. Jonah activated the outer field with a flick of his wrist. The buried pylons lit up with dull red light, forming a transparent dome of energy that shimmered as the first hostile pulse struck at light, screaming across the barrier like a comet before dispersing into harmless sparks. They're testing us, he said. Velshera nodded. They're confident. They believe I still fear them. Do you? She turned to him. Not anymore. He handed her a weapon small, compact, and familiar. She took it, flipping the safety off with muscle memory honed in her warrior consort days. Jonah adjusted his rifle and looked at her. You know the terrain better. You take the south flank. I'll keep the front gate. Velshera hesitated. If they breach dash. They won't. But if they do dash, then they'll wish they hadn't. Jonah's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Outside, the sky shifted as the attackers dispersed, moving like ink spilled across glass. One stayed centered, chanting in an unholy rhythm, while the others fanned out, scanning for weaknesses. The ground sensors spiked. Heat signatures flickered like angry moths in the dark. Jonah moved into position behind the upper ledge overlooking the main crop field. He laid prone, calibrated his scope, and drew a bead on the closest figure. He didn't shoot. Not yet. These weren't raiders or mindless beasts. These were surgical killers trained to provoke and lure. The moment he fired, they would know his position, calculate the angle, measure his breathing. But he wasn't some planetary farmhand with a blaster. He was a soldier retired, yes, but not forgotten by the instincts that had kept him alive through 2 galactic fronts and a silent coup on Phoenix Delta. Velshera crouched at the base of the wind turbine array, her weapon lowered, but her posture poised. Her mind sifted through old combat patterns, linguistic threats, and defense codes passed down in whispered traditions. The moment they activated the nullifier grid again, she would fire not at the device, but at the one behind it. The priest. Always aim for the one who chants. The sky cracked with the sudden scream of pressure as the enemy launched coordinated pulses at the eastern fence. The auto turrets whirled and lit up the dark with blinding flashes, tracking movement, burning shadows into the rocks. Jonah fired one clean shot right through the robed chest of the closest attacker. The body crumpled without a sound, its feet touching ground only in death. Another robed figure leapt, deflecting turret fire with a crystalline shield, hurling a globule of antimatter foam toward the homestead. It splashed against the energy dome, sizzling, but the barrier held. Velshera emerged from the shadows like a ghost, flanking the second priest before they could recalibrate. Her weapon hummed once, and a pulse of violet energy severed the priest's neural harness. They collapsed mid-air, their levitation breaking, slamming into the desert floor with the wet thud of irreversible failure. The central priest screamed in rage, words mangled with psychic force. You embrace filth. You protect a mistake. Jonah stood upright behind his cover. Then call me the janitor, 'cause I'm cleaning your mess. He fired. The priest staggered but did not fall. Their robes flared, their energy matrix adapting. They raised the nullifier, but Velshera was already moving, running faster than Jonah had seen her move since arriving. She vaulted a boulder, landed hard, rolled under a jet of energy, and launched herself forward, using her own body as a wedge. Her blade half metal, half-living crystal extended from her wrist in a flicker of old war tech. It struck home, embedding into the nullifier's power spine. The detonation was small, but it sent both of them flying. Jonah screamed her name, but she was already rising, bleeding from her forehead, panting, one shoulder dislocated but alive. The priest twitched, broken and dying. They hissed one last curse. The child will doom you all. Velshera leaned down and said, then let her. And with a final whisper from her lips, the priest expired. The field was still again. The remaining attackers fled, abandoning the dead. Cowards. Tradition-bound fools with no courage for true confrontation. Jonah checked the sensors, no new signatures. He hurried to Velshera, helped her up, cradling her as she winced. You're insane, he muttered. Is that complaint or compliment? Bit of both. Inside the house, Allery stirred but did not cry. She opened her eyes, glowing faintly now. She reached out, though the battle had ended minutes ago, and her small hand touched the window pane, right where the stars began to shine through the retreating clouds. Jonah and Velshera stood beside each other as the dust settled. The enemy was gone for now, but the message was clear. The child was not just a threat. She was a prophecy in flesh. And those who feared change would come again. But so would they. Together. The desert always remembers. That's what Jonah believed, watching the aftermath of the night's violence settle into the folds of the land. The dunes bore no scars. The crops whispered in the breeze as if they hadn't almost burned. The sensor pylons blinked like distant stars, and the rising sun gilded everything in light that had no opinion on what had happened. But the land remembered its stored violence like heat, slow and silent, buried until something stirred it again. And Jonah had lived on this land long enough to feel the change, like a tremor beneath his boots, not seismic but spiritual, a quiet rearranging of fate. Inside the homestead, Velshera lay half asleep on the treatment bed, shoulder-bound, bruises treated with gel. Jonah had mixed himself. He'd stayed up through the night, keeping vigil over her. She had given everything to stop the priest and protect Allery, and now she rested with the sleep of someone who knew they'd earned one more day. Jonah had never admired anyone more in his life. She wasn't just strong. She was sacred. And yet, she was humble in it, never demanding, never self-glorifying. She fought like someone who had already died once and come back only because love wouldn't let her stay gone. Allery had not cried. In fact, she had grown. Stranger. The morning after the attack, Jonah had walked into the main room, and found the child sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor, completely still. Peg floated above her, its thrusters silenced as though commanded to remain motionless. Light poured in from the windows in golden shafts, but it didn't touch Allery the same way it shimmered through her, refracting like water. Her eyes were open, glowing faintly, and her hands were cupped in her lap. She looked up at him and said clearly, in a voice not shaped by her physical age, "They will return. But not in the form you expect." Jonah froze, his hand halfway to the kettle. "What did you just say?" Allery blinked, and the glow dimmed. She tilted her head. "Hungry." He knelt beside her slowly. "What did you mean just now? About the return?" She looked at him with innocent curiosity, her baby voice returning. "Peg says Storm is coming." "Peg is funny." Jonah looked up at the drone. It remained suspended, inactive. Peg didn't say anything. Allery giggled. "He says things. You don't hear them like I do." Velshera's words echoed in Jonah's memory dash. "She feels more than I do. Not just emotions." This wasn't normal. This wasn't something that could be chalked up to trauma or cleverness. Something inside the girl was waking up, and it wasn't human, nor entirely alien either. It was something else. Something new. He made her breakfast and watched as she ate quietly, methodically, her hands deft but not rushed. She didn't eat like a toddler. She ate like someone whose body obeyed them precisely. She didn't spill or fumble. She even thanked him after, mimicking Velshera's cadence. But it wasn't just mimicry. It was awareness, as if she understood the meaning behind gestures, not just the shapes of them. By noon, Velshera had woken and taken a few steps under her own power. She gritted through the pain, refusing to let her injuries slow her. She joined Jonah in the outer greenhouse, eyes scanning the horizon constantly, though there was no new movement. When he told her what Allery had said, she did not laugh. She did not question it. "She's begun early," Velshera murmured. "Begun what?" "The drift. It's what we called it, before we outlawed it. Children born with psionic sensitivity to the pulse fields of living thought. Most fade by age 6. Their minds burn out from overload. But some very rare adapt. They don't just feel. They echo. They reflect emotion, intention, sometimes even fragments of memory or fate. She has inherited more than I thought possible." Jonah rubbed his face. "So what does that mean for us?" "It means," Velshera said darkly, "the council will not send priests next time. They will send hunters. Or worse, seekers who consume what they cannot classify." Jonah swallowed. "Then we can't stay here." Velshera nodded. "Not for long." He looked around the farm, his home, his solitude, the only place that ever felt like his in a galaxy that had otherwise moved on without him. He thought about the years he'd buried himself in the work of staying alive, not for purpose, but for penance. And now he looked at Allery, this strange, glowing child who somehow trusted him more than anyone else in the universe, and he felt something shift in him. This was no longer his world. It was hers, and he would burn the sky before he let them take it away from her. "We'll need transport," he said. "Fast, silent, shielded. The old sublevel garage has that miner's crawler. I can retrofit it." Velshera raised an eyebrow. "That thing? It barely runs. Used to barely run. I've kept it up over the years. Didn't know why. Maybe now I do." She stepped toward him, gripping his forearm gently. "Jonah, you don't have to do this." He turned to her, eyes steel. "I do. I didn't fight a war, lose friends, and survive just to watch a child with a chance for the future get erased because some self-righteous ghosts hate what they can't control." She held his gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. Not a vow. Something deeper. That night, Jonah worked for hours in the sublevel sparking cables, welding joints, rewiring fusion cells. Velshera cleaned what she could, packing supplies, converting dried rations into protein bricks, boiling water into storage packs. They didn't need words. Their urgency was a rhythm, a pact in motion. Allery slept peacefully, but in her dreams, she whispered names Jonah didn't recognize. Stars that hadn't been named in human tongues. Cities made of glass that floated. A voice, sometimes hers, sometimes many, said, "She is waking. The world will feel it." When Jonah finally collapsed into a chair at 0300 hours, his hands blistered and face soot-streaked, Velshera sat beside him with a quiet strength that made him forget the pain. "She's not a mistake," he said softly. Velshera shook her head. "No, she's what comes after the mistakes." Jonah leaned his head back and looked at the stars through the open ceiling panel. Then we'd better be ready. The universe doesn't like being changed. Velshera smiled faintly. Then it's time someone changed it back. Jonah didn't sleep. Even after Velshera drifted off in a sitting position beside the toolshed, her head nodding softly and a blanket draped around her shoulders, he stayed awake in the crawl space of the old miner's rig, buried elbow-deep in fusion relays and cracked coolant lines that hadn't carried a proper charge in half a decade. His body protested with each motion, a dull ache setting in that reminded him he was no longer the lean combat engineer who once ran field ops through cratered moons and gas station ambushes. But grit had its own stamina, and Jonah had reserves of it stored away in the silence of long winters and broken nights, all of which he now poured into this one vehicle, a battered machine that would become, for a little while, a womb of escape for a woman and a child who were never supposed to survive. By the third hour, the crawler's primary core flickered to life, rumbling with uncertain energy like an old man waking from a coma. Jonah grinned through cracked lips and reached for the diagnostic panel. He bypassed what systems he could, reprogrammed the stabilizers to ignore the missing coils, and rerouted the exhaust filters to blow straight into the lower vents. Unorthodox and a bit dangerous, but it would mask the crawler's signature on most aerial sweeps. It would run hot. It would stink, but it would move. When dawn broke across the valley, the first golden rays didn't find peace waiting for them, they found motion. Velshera was already outside, strapping down satchels and crates onto the crawler's cargo platform, her body stiff but determined. Allery sat bundled beside Peg on the seat, humming something ancient, her eyes fixed on the morning as if watching the future arrive from over the hills. Jonah came out last, dragging the final energy cell into place with fingers that barely had skin left to give. He didn't say much, just grunted as he activated the engine, the entire vehicle rising 6 inches off the ground on its gravplate rig. It wobbled, sparked briefly, and then stabilized. Velshera looked at him with weary pride, and Jonah offered her a tired smile that said more than any words ever could. She helped him load the last of the provisions and climbed into the passenger seat, cradling Allery. As the crawler lifted into motion and turned toward the eastward ridge, Jonah took one final glance at the homestead behind them. The farm was quiet. The windmill turned slowly. The greenhouse glittered faintly in the morning mist, and the perimeter fence blinked lazily, unaware that this would be the last time it would protect anyone. Jonah let out a slow breath and turned his back on it. He had built that place to die alone. Now he left it to live with purpose. They traveled for hours through sun-beaten canyons and over dunes that looked like frozen waves. The crawler moved sluggishly but faithfully, its patched systems groaning under the strain but holding together. Velshera held a map projected from a shard of starglass, an old piece of her people's navigational tech, still pulsing with stored star maps. She guided Jonah toward a place he'd never heard of, the Cleft of the Unspoken, a narrow rift between two tectonic ridges where magnetic interference disrupted most scans. If they could make it there, she said, they'd be invisible for weeks, maybe long enough to find passage off-world. But the universe is not merciful to those who carry miracles in their arms. At the end of the second day, as night fell and they pulled the crawler beneath a stony outcropping to rest, Velshera stiffened as she lifted Allery from her sling. The child had fallen strangely silent, not asleep, not quite awake. Her body trembled faintly, and her small hands were ice cold. Jonah dropped what he was doing and rushed over, crouching beside them. What's happening? Velshera's voice was tight, clipped by fear. She's reaching. Reaching for what? For them. Velshera placed her palm on Allery's chest, her eyes narrowing as she whispered in an ancient dialect Jonah barely recognized. She's dreaming while awake. Something is trying to pull her back. Jonah clenched his jaw. Through the mind. Yes. It's not a weapon. Not exactly. It's a tether. A memory hook. Something the Exarchs left in her before we fled. A final trap. The air grew heavier. Jonah felt it too, though he had no psionic sensitivity. The very space around them felt weighted, stretched, like reality itself was being thinned. Then Allery opened her mouth and screamed. Not in pain, not in fear, but in resonance. It was a sound like a shattered bell, like the cry of a newborn star, and the stones around them vibrated with its force. Jonah instinctively reached to cradle her, but Velshera held him back. No. Let her anchor herself. If we interfere, it might break her. Minutes passed. Then 5. 10. And then, without warning, Allery breathed not shallow and weak, but deep and calm. Her eyes opened, brighter than ever, swirling with hues of blue and gold and violet that no species had ever catalogued. She looked at Jonah and smiled. They're gone, she whispered. Jonah blinked. Who? The ones listening. They can't hear me anymore. Velshera held her child, her hands shaking. How? Allery leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, already dozing. Because I am not theirs. Jonah watched as the child fell back into sleep. She broke the tether herself, he said, more statement than question. Velshera nodded, lips pressed tight. She's more than we guessed. More than they feared. Jonah looked up at the stars rising in the clear sky. Then we need to keep moving. Wherever she's going to grow into what she's meant to be, it's not here. They drove into the night with no lights. The crawler hummed beneath them, a tired beast carrying history in the form of a child. Every bump in the trail reminded them of their fragility. Every echo in the canyon whispered of watching eyes. But Allery slept peacefully, and in her dreams, entire galaxies blinked into being. The rift was barely visible until they were already upon it. A jagged wound in the landscape, where the world had once been torn open by tectonic wrath, now cooled and concealed beneath layers of wind-blown sand and ancient stone. It stretched for kilometers, a narrow slit just wide enough for a crawler to slip through, and deep enough that no light ever touched its bottom. Velshera sat beside Jonah as they descended into its winding throat, her arms coiled tightly around Allery's now peaceful body, and her eyes scanning the walls for any sign that they had been tracked. They hadn't spoken much in the last 2 days, not because there was nothing to say, but because too much pulsed in the spaces between their words. Jonah's knuckles bore new blisters from wrenching the crawler over rough terrain. Velshera's shoulders ached from cradling a child who no longer slept in stillness, but with a strange celestial hum vibrating faintly through her small bones. And Allery, though silent most of the time, had begun to speak in her dreams words from languages Jonah didn't know and Velshera swore had never been spoken aloud. The girl had changed again, subtly. Her eyes now reflected things they hadn't seen, her presence like the center of a field that bent time around her gently, like gravity of the soul. The rift opened wider as they drove, curving into a long-forgotten valley choked with vines and broken remnants of an old satellite colony. What had once been steel and solar panels was now a forest of rusted bones woven over with mossy carpets and thornglass flowers that sang in the wind. Peg floated ahead, scanning cautiously. Environmental anomalies detected. No active signals. Biological presence minimal. Hostility index low. Vibe check, surprisingly hopeful. Jonah chuckled under his breath. I should have deleted that attitude chip. No, Velshera said softly. Keep it. Even machines should have a voice when the world becomes too quiet. They made camp beneath the arc of a collapsed skybridge. Jonah reinforced the perimeter with a portable emitter while Velshera arranged stones in a ceremonial ring in old rite from her mother's people to ward off spectral interference. Allery sat in the middle of the circle, humming to herself and stacking pebbles into neat pyramids. Jonah watched her work and realized she was building them in sequences 3, 5, 8. Fibonacci spirals in miniature. The child's mind was already expanding far beyond the scope of any species' understanding. And yet she was still a little girl, fascinated by colors, soothed by lullabies, and always quick to reach for Jonah's hand when shadows loomed too long. That night, as firelight danced against the stone and a quiet peace settled over the camp, Velshera told him the truth, not the parts she had hidden out of shame or protection, but everything. She was not supposed to live, she said, staring into the flames. When they saw her scans, they summoned me before the council and demanded I destroy her before she even drew breath. They said her genome contained the mirror spark, a theoretical strand thought to create quantum synesthesia consciousness capable of seeing across timelines. I thought it was a myth. I begged them to let her be born. They said no. So I ran. I hid among the lower caste birthers, faked records, bribed exile traders. And when she came into the world, I knew she was not mine to control. She was meant. Jonah didn't respond right away. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the embers swirl upward like spirits too light to rest. Then he said, "You think she's the key to something?" "No," Velshera whispered. "I think she's the answer to something none of us have asked yet." They were silent for a long while after that. Sometime deep in the night, Allery rose without waking. She walked out of the circle barefoot, her tiny feet quiet on the stone. Jonah stirred at the movement, but something in him said not to stop her. Velshera followed too, at a distance. The girl moved through the jungle of forgotten machinery like she had walked it 1,000 times, her hands brushing the old hulls, her eyes half closed. She climbed atop a collapsed comms array and looked up at the stars. "Come out," she said, her voice no longer that of a toddler. "I see you." And from the shadows, they emerged. Not soldiers, not priests, not hunters. Children. 5 of them scrawny, pale, clothed in the remains of ceremonial garb now ripped and stained by time. They were from Velshera's own kind, castaways like her, survivors of other purges, perhaps sent here long ago and forgotten. Their eyes were wide, and they looked at Allery not with fear, but awe. One of them stepped forward, no older than 6, and whispered, "You're the dream seed, aren't you?" Allery smiled. "I'm just Allery." But her hand glowed faintly, and in the dirt at her feet, light bloomed like a map unfolding in silence. Jonah and Velshera watched from behind a broken shuttle fuselage. The children clustered around her, not touching, just listening. And Allery began to speak not words, but images, thoughts, a melody carried through the space between minds. Jonah saw flickers of it. Trees with crystal roots, stars reborn from black holes, a world without castes or boundaries, where names didn't matter, only kindness. By morning, the children had led them deeper into the canyon. There, hidden behind a false cliff of collapsed debris, was what remained of a pre-collapse biohabitat, a garden, grown wild, fed by geothermal vents and unregistered by satellites. Dozens of exiled families had once lived here, according to the oldest of the children, but time and hardship had taken all but a few. Yet the garden still bloomed. They decided to stay, not forever, but long enough to begin something. Jonah reinforced the habitat systems with Peg's help, restoring power to the old fusion lanterns. Velshera began teaching the children science, language, the old histories of her people, rewritten now with honesty and compassion. And Allery? She became something more than either of them could have imagined. A beacon, a child of light in a place the stars had forgotten. She played with the others, taught them songs she'd never been taught, showed them how to heal a broken insect or calm a wild beast just by sitting still. They built a new home out of pieces of the old one. And as the seasons shifted and dust storms passed over them like slow-moving gods, no soldiers came. No seekers. The council had turned its gaze elsewhere, or perhaps it had finally realized. Some fires burn brighter in exile. Some seeds only bloom in broken soil. And in the heart of the canyon, the child who should never have existed laughed as she ran barefoot through flowers that sang. The days that followed were not easy, but they were true. That alone made them sacred. Jonah became something he never imagined himself to be, not just a caretaker or protector, but a builder of legacies. While the other children, these quiet-eyed exiles who had once known only fear and hunger, began to recover under Velshera's calm guidance. He spent his mornings repairing shattered biodomes and retrofitting power conduits with scavenged parts. By evening, his hands were raw, his back on fire, but he felt more alive than he had in 20 years. He taught the older boys and girls how to tend the crops and run diagnostics on weather drones. He taught them how to think like engineers, how to fix what others discarded, how to imagine new paths when the road ahead was ash. Velshera too changed, though she would not admit it. At night, after she had put Allery to bed, she would sit by the fire pit and write in long scrolls salvaged from an old data scribe, transcribing a new history, a history of the forgotten, of those denied names and castes. She no longer wrote in the dialect of the sires. She wrote in something simpler, something freer. The children had asked her once if she was a queen, and she had smiled a little and said, "No, I am your witness." The garden deepened. The habitat, once a fractured remnant of a failed escape, grew under their care into something real, a living breath between two dying stars. They built new walls with their hands, raised towers from debris and wove vines through them for shade. They discovered springs deep underground and began cultivating new food strains, hybrids between the flora Jonah brought in through old Earth archives and the wild things Velshera remembered from her homeworld. The others, those who had wandered, who had heard whispers of a sanctuary where the dream seed lived, began to arrive in the quiet weeks of the second cycle. Some came limping, some starving, some carried broken things in their arms and asked, "Is it true? Is this where she lives?" And when they saw Allery, they wept. Not because she spoke prophecies, not because she burned with some divine power, but because when she reached out her small hand and placed it on theirs, they felt for the first time in their lives not forgotten. The people did not worship her. That would have made her something small. Instead, they followed not behind her, but alongside her. When she walked through the rows of fruit-bearing trees Jonah had grown, people bowed not because they had to, but because it was their way of thanking the universe for one more day in her presence. And she simply smiled. She spoke little, even as she aged, but her smile was enough. It became the symbol carved into the stones at the canyon's entrance, where Jonah built a small archway with salvaged steel and polished obsidian. A gateway not just to a hiding place, but to a beginning. One evening, Jonah and Velshera stood on the upper ridge overlooking the valley. The air shimmered with heat and golden pollen drifting like lazy fireflies. Allery played with the youngest children far below, laughing as they chased glowing beetles that responded to her touch with colors no human had ever cataloged. Jonah leaned against a post he'd just finished hammering into place, an old radio tower he was converting into a signal booster. Not to call for help, but in case others were lost, in case hope needed a path home. "She's changing the rules," he said quietly. Velshera nodded. "She's not breaking them, just showing the world they were never real to begin with." He glanced at her. "Do you think they'll come again? The Exarchs? They might, but it won't matter." She turned to him fully, her face calm, aged only by memory. "We aren't running anymore. We're growing something they cannot kill." He looked at her for a long time. "You're different now." "So are you," she said softly. And they stood there for a long while, shoulder to shoulder. Not lovers, not warriors, just two people who had dared to love something that didn't fit the laws of the world, and in doing so, rewrote the future. Years passed. Allery grew into a tall, graceful being, neither fully human nor fully alien, her skin catching starlight like a prism. She became a teacher, not with words, but through presence. It was said that to walk with her through the orchard was to understand peace, that her gaze could heal grief, that when she sang, which was rare, the trees leaned in to listen. Jonah grew older, slower, but never bitter. He became the village's heart, its stubborn rock. Children clung to his knees and asked him to tell the stories of the stars and the machine wars and the day the council came and failed. Velshera aged more slowly, her bloodline still resisting time, but she never left his side. She wrote their history as it happened. She chronicled not just the facts, but the feelings, the mornings of laughter, the nights of sorrow, the way it felt to breathe air not laced with fear. One day, decades later, when the stars above burned blue and strange, and Jonah's hair had turned to silver, he sat beneath the flowering tree he and Allery had planted together. She now stood tall beside him, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes older than the sun's. He asked her, "Did we do it? Did we make something that matters?" She knelt beside him, kissed his forehead, and said, "We didn't make it. You did. I just helped it bloom." And when Jonah Myers, human farmer and ex-soldier, finally closed his eyes for the last time beneath that tree, he did so smiling. Because he had not just saved a mother and a child. He had saved a future.